Okay, everybody, we're going to get started. So if I can ask you to take your seats if you're staying for the panel discussion. Welcome to those of you who are just new for this session, and welcome back to those who've been with us today and yesterday. This is the Boston Flash Forward Festival, brought to you by the Magenta Foundation. So my name is Rachel Hilton. I am a board member of the Magenta Foundation from Toronto, and welcome all. So you're going to be treated to a scintillating panel discussion about critique and the creative process. Should be very interesting, presented by the Photographic Research Center. And I bring you your esteemed panel, Glenn Ruga, Executive Director of PRC, and then we have the panelists, also sitting beside Glenn, Chalice Hegner, Bruce Myron, and Neil Rantoul. So we'll be going until probably for about an hour, I'd say, and then rather than having a sample critique session, we're actually going to have a Q&A, so that'll be happening at the end of the discussion. So I ask you to please give a warm welcome to all of your panelists.
Thank you, Rachel, and I want to thank the Flash Forward Festival for inviting us here today to present this discussion. My name's Glenn Ruga. The first thing I'd like to do is ask everybody to come forward as much as possible, because this will be interactive. Actually, the Q&A is going to be throughout the entire program, not just at the end. So I'd really like to encourage people to move up so we can hear you talk. I have this great microphone in front of me, but I don't think you'll have that luxury. So to hear you would be great if you could move forward. I'd like to start off with a bit of levity and present a video that I found on the internet on YouTube while doing some research on critique in art schools. Yeah.
Oh, in my last video about art school, I happened to leave out one of the most important experiences you have there, the critique. Whoa. I mean, it can be bad, but usually not that bad. A critique, usually called a crit by those of us in the know, is when your peers and professor gather to talk about everybody's projects. Those of us in the know usually call that a class. Sometimes they can be really great. Everyone likes your work and you get some good feedback about how to make it better next time. But sometimes it doesn't go quite so well. So this is my poster. I spent a really long time on it because I had some trouble figuring out the clear hierarchy. What is this monstrosity? Get this piece of crap off my walls right now and go throw it away in someone else's trash can so that nobody knows it came from my class. Yes, there is a teacher at RISD who actually says that. I didn't have him, but I did have this guy. Alright, so this is my piece. I really wanted to represent... Stop. Let's see it upside down. No. Hand me those scissors, will you? Now see how much more dynamic that is? Sometimes the classmates can be worse though, especially if it's one of your first crits. So this is my poster. I spent a really long time on it. Do you like it? I'm a little confused about the emotion you're trying to invoke with this piece. The juxtaposition of the red and the blue imply a sense of patriotism, but the explosive nature of the texture around it implies a certain dissonance with the reality of the world around you. That's exactly what I was thinking. Though, even worse than that is when this happens. So I really would like to know what you think of the typography especially, and how it works with the overall message I was trying to send. Anyone? What? Oh, I like it. Thanks. Or when this happens. So I would really like to know what you guys think of the execution of my main concept. Oh, look at that All right, Michael Buckley, want to send us out?
Stay awesome. And Karen's such a nerd, she wanted me to say something about typography. Typography.
I definitely just tripped over my tripod.
All right, I hope I could be as entertaining as she is. All right, I'd just like to get a sense here. Who here has been in a crit? All right, most people. And also just to get a sense of the audience, who out there are educators or teachers or do crits from the critique side? And then how about photographers and artists who are on the receiving end? All right, great. Right. In the course of doing some preparation for this, I was looking online, and there's a fair amount written on the critique process, although one of the reasons why we're doing this presentation is that we feel that it's not really discussed that much amongst people who do it or people who are engaged in critiques, and that's the whole point of this, to give us an opportunity to really talk about what this is all about. But I did find some interesting quotes on the web I'd just like to read for you. First one by Marvin Bartel from Emphatic Critique. Learning to experiment by learning to use a broad spectrum of self-critique and peer critique questions is the essence of what makes a successful artist. Real scientists know that their unexpected outcomes may be important discoveries. Real artists know that there are no mistakes. Okay. Next one from a New York Times article in 2006 from Tales from the Crit for art students, May is the cruelest month. Think about the general nightmare of standing nude in public, said the painter Lisa Yuskavage, who earned her degree in 1986 from Yale. But add something else, but add something else, your fear, like standing nude on a scale. So this is her perspective on what a critique might be like. And then the last one. A critique is a planned exercise or discussion agreed on by all parties. It is not involuntary criticism thrown at an artist while caught off guard, against their wishes or without their express permission. So we could see that there's been some scholarship on this issue, trying to bring some of it in here today with people who have been very experienced on doing critiques and receiving critiques, and you out there who have done both. I'd like to read the bios of our presenters, and then each of them will talk for a bit about their own perspectives on it. And then over the conduct of this panel will be that I'll pose questions, the three of them will engage in a discussion on each question, and then we'll invite you into each question. And we'll do this for the next, I guess, hour and a half. So Chehalis Hegner received her MFA in Visual Arts at the Art Institute of Boston in 2005. She's currently a member of the Art Department faculty at the University of Massachusetts Lowell and serves on the board of the Photographic Resource Center on the campus of Boston University. In 2010, Chehalis received the Gian Mili Photography Prize from Kosovo. She has exhibited in solo and group exhibitions in the US and Europe in galleries, including the Photographic Resource Center, the Art Institute of Boston, Maryland Art Place, St. Gaudens National Historic Site, the Cultural Center in Italy, the Interlochen Arts Academy in Michigan, the MIT Museum, and the National Gallery of Art in Kosovo. To my right, Neil Rantoul is a career artist and teacher. He taught photography since 1971. He's the past head of the photography program at Northeastern University, is a professor emeritus, and taught for 13 years at Harvard University, as well as several years at the New England School of Photography. He retired from Northeastern in January 2012. Rantoul has work in numerous public and private collections, including the Museum of Fine Arts, the De Cordova Sculpture Museum and Sculpture Park, the Fogg Art Museum, the High Museum, the Kunsthaus, the Center for Creative Photography, and Princeton University. He's a recipient of many awards and grants, including the Whiting Foundation Fellowship, a Lightwork Residency, and he was a finalist twice for the Massachusetts Cultural Council Award. Neil's a member of the board of directors of the PRC and is on the board of corporators of the Griffin Museum of Photography. He's an active exhibitor, workshop leader, portfolio reviewer, and consultant. And then on my far right is Bruce Myron, an artist and photographer based in Cambridge, Massachusetts. He holds a BFA in photography from Massachusetts College of Art and Design and earned his MFA in studio art with a concentration in photography from the University of Connecticut Storrs in 2009. Bruce is a critic at the Rhode Island School of Design, adjunct faculty at the Art Institute of Boston at Leicester University, a visiting lecturer of art at Amherst College, and the chair of the Northeast region of the Society of Photographic Education. Shown nationally and recently featured in Fraction magazine, Myron has been included in group exhibitions at the Houston Center for Photography and the William Benton Museum of Art in Connecticut, among other venues. His latest solo exhibition includes showings at the Workspace Gallery, the Special Collections Gallery of the Jones Library in Amherst, Massachusetts, the Danforth Museum of Art, and Gallery KFS, where he is represented. Myron has presented on panels at the National Conference of the College Art Association and the Society for Photographic Education. And one other person I'd like to introduce is Arthur Ganson on my immediate left, who will be taking notes of this, handwriting them with a Wacom tablet, and hopefully this will help us just write down some of our ideas and thoughts. And if it turns out we have something that we'd like to distribute at the end, we could make this available as files on the PRC website for you to download if you'd like to access that at a later point. All right, so let me first introduce Chehalis Hegner to the podium to talk about her personal experiences doing critique.
It's an interesting question, like how can you sum it all up? And I think if I had to say one sentence, as someone who is in the position of being a mentor, it's how can I be most useful? And it may be even a bit corny, but I would say that as a mentor, you're also in the position of really tending to something very fragile oftentimes. So I think it's really, for me, it's really important to always ask, how can I be most useful to this person, young artist, more advanced artist, or even colleagues, friends that are wanting feedback. And we were discussing it a little bit before, out under the umbrella out there, and I was remembering, well, what were the most memorable moments in my career so far in terms of critiques that were given to me? And they seem to be the most traumatic ones. Maybe we just are most impacted by trauma, but I mean, I do remember other useful comments, but the ones that really stayed with me were actually not really happy memories. So Glenn asked us to bring some anecdotes as an introduction, and I'm going to start with two little stories, and I'm sure lots of people have really positive stories, but I think in terms of working together as a community, it's going to be important to have some really agreed upon healthy ground rules in order to make it a really useful experience. So when I was working on my MFA, I had produced a video piece, and I had someone critiquing, and her comment after she looked at the piece was, you know, it looks like a gay porn film. And I said, oh, really? Which one exactly? And she said, well, you know, just anyone. I said, well, you know, I'm paying a lot of money for my education, so next class, I'd really like you to bring in some examples of exactly which components of that are the same as my piece. And she hated me from then on, and, you know, so I think, do you respond to a violent, combative response that's not useful? Or do you just say, thank you very much, I'll consider that, and go home and forget it? But I tend to be a bit of a fighter, so it worked out that way. And then Neil has agreed to do a little role play with me. I went to the studio of a very famous Boston photographer who was interested in looking at my work, and I had just started out. I'd been making photographs for about 1.5 years, and I brought my big box of photographs to his studio. And I don't know, maybe we can just put this up here.
Hi,
Thank you so much for bringing your work by, Neil.
I'm Alfred Stieglitz, and I'd like you to look
Okay, Al. I'm not going to actually, I don't think there's going to be room here, but I'm going to pretend that I'm, shit. Shit. Shit.
But
Alfred, don't bring me shit. If you're going to come to my studio, don't bring me shit. 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 And then he begins to weep. Tears are now dripping on my photograph. Alfred, this is a great photograph. Alfred, this is always going to be a great photograph. I want to trade one of my photographs for this photograph. I'm not sure when, but shit. Shit. Okay, so basically it went like that. Come and show me your work in another 6 months. So anyway, I'll wrap up there, and that's my little intro.
Thank you, Chehalis. Neil?
I just retired in January from a career of teaching photography at the university level for 41 years. So I'd like to think that I know something about this process called critique. I'm not sure I do, but let me share a few things with you. My career, I always characterized or defined as being as a bookends teacher. I have a career where I taught intro photo every single year since 1970. And for many of those years, probably the past 15 years or so, I also taught senior thesis students. And the senior thesis students I had for the whole year. So critiquing an intro student who was putting their work up on a panel to be talked about for the first time versus a student who'd been studying for 4 or 5 years was a very different thing. And I learned early on in my teaching career that to be heavy-handed or to be severely critical to somebody who had just made photographs probably for the first time was probably a little severe. So I tended to be very light and very matter-of-fact about looking at pictures to intro students. And we would talk about the process that they'd gone through to get to the picture and what their reaction was and how that functioned in terms of the final outcome of the photograph. The seniors, on the other hand, were a very different situation. And one of the things I needed to do with them, and some of you may be seniors or in graduate programs studying in this way, tends to be very intense. In the fall, in September, I would work quite hard on coalescing the group, making it a group that would be behind each other rather than stabbing each other in the back. A lot of our classes of 3 or 4 hours a week were just critique. So in those early sessions, I worked pretty hard on trying to get them out to try to be able to speak about their work. And if you've been in that kind of context, you know that that can be very difficult for people to do. So I tried to praise them and give them confidence to speak up. And I would call them out. I would actually, if they weren't speaking up in class, I would say, I would make them do that. As the year went on and the group did coalesce and become more of a unit, I found what I did as a teacher was to pull back and to be less and less important to the group and allow them to speak to each other. And I always had this strong belief that you learn more from your classmates and your colleagues within the field than you do, in effect, the teacher. So by the time it was, I don't know, April or May, where it was getting to be towards the end of the year, I was very much not a part of it so much, but just really observing or just kind of pointing at things occasionally. And it seemed to work because they did. They worked through some of their issues together, and their confidence increased, and then they were able to speak up more. How am I doing on time? Have I got a little bit more time? Just one little anecdote. I would use props and tactics in whatever class to try to get people to, number one, be more confident about what they were doing and talking about, but also to get them to speak up. And one of them I used for years was this, which is a Rhode Island school design portfolio. And I had been a student there in the 70s, and every year the students would produce 150 copies of the portfolio. So as a student who did that for a couple of years, I had a portfolio. I would bring it into my classes. I was teaching at Northeastern, and I would hand out a photograph to each student in the class and tell them that that was their photograph and that they had made that photograph. They'd look at it a little bit, they'd think about what they wanted to say, and I'd go around the room and ask them to speak about that photograph like they had made it. And some of them were handling photographs by Harry Callan and Aaron Siskin, two of my teachers. They didn't know it, but they were. And they would get into the role playing of it being their photograph and where they'd been in Mexico somewhere taking the picture. And it was a way to kind of get them out of their own inhibitions about their own work and put their energy into something else that was visual. And it was sort of a starting or a kind of foundation that we established by which we would be able to talk about pictures. Thank you.
Bruce Myron.
Hi, everybody. So, much like Chehalis, I have some experiences where the situation was not so great, and but not quite that bad. Although one recently, just very recently, that I won't even talk about except to mention it here, was horrendous. But my very first critique when I went to some place and got my work critiqued, it was about like 6 years ago, I guess, and I brought out, I was very proud of this work. It's a body of work I've been working on for a really long time, and I brought it out, and I started explaining about the work and talking about the work, and the guy's going through it, and I said, he said, so what about the rest of the world? I was a project called the 40th Parallel, and so I'm only doing it in the United States. And he said, well, isn't it important? Isn't that line important in the rest of the world? Isn't the rest of the world important? And I was like, no, it's not. And he just like, for my purposes, it wasn't important. But he made me think about. I mean, I was very upset at the time, and I almost cried, and I was like, oh, that's crazy, but I was very, very upset. But it stuck with me in a way that I like to try to instill in my students, is that it stuck with me in a way that made me think about, well, all right, I'm trying to communicate something, right? And so the reason I go to this and the reason I produce work is to communicate some idea. And what he was telling me was that, in fact, what I was saying wasn't really getting through to him. And so it made me think about how I communicate and what I want to do with that work in particular and how I talk about that work. And so I bring that when I'm doing critiques in the classroom, or when I'm doing critiques when I'm asked to do portfolio reviews. I kind of try to remember that for myself and share that with my person in some way. Not maybe directly, but it's always in the back of my mind. And that's, I think, something that we can think about too. You can think about when you're getting it. It's often the things that kind of stick in your craw that are the important things to remember about your work, right? It's the things that don't feel quite right that somebody tells you, or things that you are repulsed by at first, are usually the things you can learn the most from. So that's kind of where I'm coming at. That's it. Thanks.
Okay. Well, I think at least two of the panelists have addressed the first question directly, but we could explore it a little bit more in a panel format and then bring all of you into the question as well. But can each of you just describe briefly, and maybe I'll address this to you, Chehalis, because you didn't really respond to this directly. How do you conduct critiques in your classroom, and what do you find to be most useful?
Well, there's a variety of things that we do based on who's sitting there in the class. If it's a really beginning class, there's usually, for the first few weeks at least, an emphasis on actually making the things, technical concerns, and then as that begins to get a little momentum, we have conversations about meaning. And
do you discuss it in classes 1, 2, and 3? Do you have critiques in the very first classes, or do you wait halfway through the semester before you actually have
every
formal?
project has a critique, a full 3-hour critique. And we use a timer method, and we have a scribe. So the person who's isn't having to write down their own notes. They have a buddy system, and everyone has their own scribe who writes down notes, so the other person can just listen and read the notes later. And I have a variety of different formats. We have the talk critique where I'm guiding it, or I will later on in the term, in any class, put the students in control so that I pick a student leader and that person is guiding the critique for the whole class maybe. I also do silent written critiques because I think it's really important to develop critical thinking skills and being able to verbalize what you're looking at and speak about what you're looking at in a confident way, so they'll quietly sit and have 10 minutes to critique, and then they'll read what they've written to each other or just hand them to the person. That's pretty much.
Okay. And Bruce and Neil, is there anything specific that you do in your classrooms?
I just wanted to add that as we talk about critique, we seem to be centering upon the classroom context. But everything we do is critiqued. Every time we show a photograph to somebody, there's an unstated or inherent critique in that process. You can read it by body language, you can read it by attention span, or whether they're answering the phone. So I hope you don't assume that what we're talking about is just a teacher at a classroom kind of context. It's really in everything.
Bruce, anything to add?
Yeah. No, I mean, I think we just in my classroom, I really just leave it up to them. I ask them all to just at first, especially with the beginning students, I ask them to just talk about what it is they're trying to do, and then we base the critique on whether or not that's successful. And I try to always remember, like especially with beginning students, I try to make sure that they understand that it's the work, not them. And that's, I think, one of the most fundamental things to remind students or anybody about is that it's the work, it's not you. I can't even remember this, honestly. I still get upset. I mean, it's just because it's my work, right? But that's the thing that I try to instill in them the most, is remembering that.
Yeah. Do either of you have anything to say about how you learned how to do critiques? Did anybody take a critique class, or was there anything you read particularly, or is it from what you just experienced in your own education background?
Trial by fire.
The critique handbook, I don't know if anybody's heard of this book. I actually meant to bring mine today and completely forgot it. It's this great little book called the critique handbook, and it's really good for that, like how to go about what you say. And
is it available on Amazon?
Yeah, it's available on Amazon. I can't remember the author or anything, but it's a great little, tiny little quick read.
I was pretty highly influenced by a teacher named Jiddu Krishnamurti, who talks a lot about the process of judgment and learning, and I really am in alignment with his philosophy on not judging but observing and sharing through dialogue. And I was also very lucky to learn something, a process developed by Liz Lerman and John Borstel called the critical response process. And she has a dance company, and it all started there, and they now kind of go around the whole world giving workshops on how organizations can communicate statements of meaning rather than chucking, judgmental indictments on people to get change.
Great. Okay, what about you in the audience? Do people have any particular experiences, both doing critiques or being critiqued that you'd like to talk about here that may not have been expressed here? Chris? Oh, we do have a microphone. Great.
I think my first critique was like yours. I went up to the main workshops. I hadn't picked up a camera in 35 years, and I wanted to begin to photograph again. And we had to show some work. And the first picture went up, and it was just what the world needs, another black and white photograph of poor Indian children. Next. Now they're in color. Next. And we kind of went that way. I've seen that one at National Geo 11 times. Next. And it got so that there were, I think, 12 photographs that we each had to show. And the person on the projector just was now programmed to hit the next button even before they were told. And they got to one of the photographs, like your little dramatization, and said, "Go back, stop." And said, "That's a great photograph."
Yeah, maybe it was the same guy.
It might have been. We'll leave that person nameless, but and he said, if by the end of the week he said, by the end of the week, I want you producing every photograph that good. And he then talked about why it was good and why the others were not. And I find in reviews that it's not very helpful to have somebody say, that's very nice work, or keep working, but to be specific.
Okay.
Whether it's good or bad, so long as it's constructive.
Does anybody else have experiences that they'd like to talk about, either doing critiques or being critiqued? Yeah. Stephanie?
I'm just going to mention that when I first went to art school and was taking my beginning level photography classes, the teachers that I had very much took the approach of really being more, encouraging and positive about what you were doing. And I've always sort of held that memory of how much it really made me enthusiastic to keep working hard. And I would say it was later down the road when I became much more critical of myself, looking for how can I improve, what's wrong with my work, I wanted to be better. But it was really, really meaningful and a strong memory of feeling so encouraged. And I just was very lucky to have good teachers, I guess. So definitely was helpful, especially, freshman level classes, So.
So mostly saying encouraging things and not negative critical things is...
Yeah, I think some of the other, the panelists talked about that, how you might, both Bruce and Neil talked about that with early entry-level classes, sort of taking a softer approach. And I think it really is just, my memories of my first years in school are so great because of that.
I think that's a really good point too, because like if you're growing a plant and it just sprouts out, if you start hacking it up and pruning it before it even has anything to shape, then it's just
right.
Cutting it off.
And when you become a little more developed in your own work, then you start turning that critical eye on yourself because you want to improve.
Yeah.
But you really need the encouragement to grow it in the beginning. So.
Yeah, but there's always opportunities to. I mean, I can be hard on people. I mean, in the classroom, and even when I'm looking at portfolios, depending on things. And so there's time. I mean, there's a way to go about it, right? So you have to be supportive, but you also have to tell them the truth. And I think that's like probably the most important thing as a teacher, is to be truthful, right? And be, as truthful as possible, even if the work is bad. You say, this is a work picture, isn't that good? And you explain why, like you were saying. Explaining why is really the important thing.
I'm enough of a traditionalist that in those earlier years, I think it's very important for people to learn to practice their craft well. And in those earlier years, very often the craft is negligent, it's not good. They don't know how to do that yet. So I think there's a lot of work to do in there because I don't think we can speak eloquently in the process that we're in if our craft isn't taken care of. And so if there are problems with that in those earlier years, that's pretty much what I'll address. I think the other thing that's come up a couple times is students or anybody in the meeting have to know what they're trying to do. And very often they don't. I mean, in 2/50th of a second, they've made a picture, and yet we hold them responsible for that 2/50th of a second. And they may not know any more about the thing they photographed than we do, the ones that are observing it. So it's important for them to, I don't know, do things like research, find out more about that material, become invested in the project that they're working in.
Other comments from the audience up here?
Yeah, I just wanted to say...
1 second for the microphone.
I think I can relate totally to what you're saying. But as you were saying it, as she was speaking, I was thinking about my own first experience. I just happened to be in a place, in a time where I was with a large group of people, and I was with somebody who's extremely high up in photography world. And I was really new, and I was very nervous. And I knew, compared to other people's work, my work was very much that of a novice. But I'm also a mature woman, so I could handle brutal honesty, and that's sort of what I was looking for. And I think that whoever's doing the critique has to sort of have an idea, be a people person. It would probably help to gauge where maybe that person's coming from, if they're a 17-year-old student or if they're a 50-year-old, engineer or whatever who's doing photography and maybe is coming to it as a new career later in life. So I was kind of hoping for something really constructive. And And what I got, and it just happened that I was the last person whose work was critiqued. And all these other people got all this constructive criticism and, you know, a lot of praise for some people's work, which I didn't really understand at the time, and different things like that. And when it came to me, I was last, and there was like almost nothing. There was like, oh, so like I've seen you took this walk. And that was it. And it was very sort of this abyss of dismissiveness. And I went home and I like sort of crawled into bed and stayed there for like 3 days. And I was like, oh my God, I suck. Like, what am I doing? Why am I doing this
Never go
again?
last.
And well, I was new. I didn't know this.
Yeah, no, I know.
And
Yeah.
so, but it was funny because I had this little card that I had gotten and put on my wall near my bed that was like a statement by Ted Kennedy that was like, you know, one of these believe in yourself and don't let anybody get in your way kind of motto things. And I thought, you know what? I'm just going to go and get some more education. I'm going to go to school. I'm going to do all the things that you said. I'm going to work on my craft. I'm not quitting. That I'm not going to stop because I fell into this sea of no response.
I can tell you just
And I think that's important.
a short story. When I was in graduate school, I had a classmate who, I went to Rhode Island School of Design. In the early 70s, a lot of us went to RISD for graduate school because if we lived in Boston, there was no graduate program. So this guy had studied with Minor White at MIT. And at some point as a senior photography student, got into a one-on-one with Minor White, showing him his portfolio. And Minor went through with each picture. At the end said, I don't really think you ought to continue doing this. and my friend walked away completely wounded. And about 2 days later, he said, that was the challenge. I was going to show him that I could succeed, and he did.
Yeah, I think to talk a little bit more about that is what I do in my earlier classes, but even sometimes to seniors and grad students, I remind them that it's a critique, and I talk to them about the fact of where they put their work and why they put it up that way, and why did they chose to go last and not try to go first or in the middle somewhere. But I literally tell them that in the classroom. When they're having, when they're last and they're like, why did I get a bad critique? And it's like, well, you went last. You hung your work in a bad place. And I think that actually helps them kind of break down the whole process so they understand that is what's going on, right? In a group situation, right? And to learn from that,
Right, one more question there.
Not to change the subject on too much of a tangent, but what you were saying about that group dynamic. As a newer educator, I think that sometimes critique can go really harsh and sometimes it can go well. And then sometimes it's just not productive at all. And I find it to be a serious challenge when you go around the room and kids go, oh, that's great. Oh, it's really pretty. Oh, sweet.
Yeah.
And, I find myself just like steamrolling into, that's not helping. What else? Why do you like it? And I think sometimes everyone just comes in on an off day, or they're just not into that particular student for whatever happens outside of the classroom. But how do you get that on a better tangent, I think is probably my biggest fear and problem in critique.
I could answer that maybe. A really quick antidote that I use for that symptom, which does come up sometimes, I just use the adjective game. I say we're going to go around the room, everyone's going to say one adjective to describe this image in some way. And some people can't even come up with one word. Like, it's incredible. But usually using the adjective thing, and sometimes they'll go around 2 or 3 times, and at least it sort of stirs the pot a little, and they don't have to get too deep or intellectual. They can just say a word. And that's something that has worked for me.
Caffeine. Bring coffee. I do that. I tell them that. Next time we're bringing coffee, everybody. Make sure you're caffeined up. And that usually kind of gets them. You make a joke. I do that a lot. I just make a joke about, kind of like, oh, we're not talking today, or, is everybody, I kind of try to do that. Just remind them that it's their, it's why they're there.
Some of my best critiques with the seniors were my classes usually ran from 1:30 to 5. By 4:30 or 5, everybody's dragging. And I had a TA one year who I would look at them and I would say, you know what I'm thinking? And that was the signal. We went to Woody's for beer. And the best critiques happened at Woody's, eating pizza, and we just extended the class. But
can you
in
do
the
that
context
now?
of having...
Can you even do that now?
Off campus.
Oh,
Yeah. So change the context is probably the message a little bit. Change the environment a little bit, shake it up.
All right, well, that leads into the next question, which is really a more focused version of the first question. And how do you really nurture the creative process? I mean, here we have students coming into school with various degrees of background in the subject, in this case photography, and they're here to grow and develop as a creative person and as a photographer. So how do you really nurture that process in the classroom?
Well, I think what Bruce said about reminding them what they're in, that they're actually in a critique physically having their work looked at is important. I also think it's very important to confirm for them why they were there in the first place. They started making pictures because they loved the process. It can get pretty intense by the time you're a second-year graduate student and you invested thousands and thousands of dollars and years of your life in it. And to remind them, this is something you guys love to do. You know, this is why we're here.
Bruce, Chehalis?
I try to see them, and I try to see their work to the best of my ability. Just sometimes, I mean, we very rarely feel seen, and we very rarely really see, and we're always trying to think of the next thing we're going to say, and just to really listen and really look and leave some space and respond in a genuine manner to the degree that we are able and that they're able. I think you also have to kind of be a little bit of, have some try to clue into what's happening psychologically for people, because some people can handle the challenge, oh, I think you should not do this anymore. But, you know, I had a trumpet teacher that told me he thought I should quit, and, you know, he was probably right. But, you know, at the end of my first trumpet lesson, I think you should give this up. You know, why? Why? I mean, I've had one lesson. You know.
Yeah, I similar to you, I try to see what the student is trying to do, and I try to guide them through that. And I try to evaluate them all on their own terms and what they're all trying to do, like as individuals and not just as a giant group. And so, you know, I try to get to what it is, why they want to take the picture. And sometimes they don't know. And, you know, giving them permission to try to figure that out and telling them it's, you know, it's okay. It's okay to not know what you want to do. Just go make pictures. It doesn't really matter. And sometimes that works, you know. Sometimes, you know, just... Sorry?
Well, let's open this up to the audience. So,
yeah.
You should not say you should not.
Yes, you should not say you should not.
Yeah.
Life will teach them whether they
Although
should or shouldn't.
Yeah, I mean, although sometimes actually, you know, again, it's like psychology. It's like sometimes it's being a psychologist. You know, sometimes you have to say, because it's best for them to say, you shouldn't do this. You should try something else, right? And it's not that you're not squashing their creativity, but you're trying to help them, guide them. And I think that's actually an important thing sometimes. And I know that, you know, probably not popular, but sometimes you need to say, you need to move on. Yeah. No, I've said it. No, I've said it. I'm sticking by that one.
Anybody else from the audience? Raise your hand if you'd like to talk so that we could bring you the microphone. Yep.
My question is this: when it's not in an academic format, okay, when you're at one of these shows, I was at the seminar yesterday afternoon, and they were talking about going to the festivals and the shows and everything, and you're going to present your work to somebody else. I think, like, even Ms. Smithson today was talking about how she works on different projects at a time. She does a little bit here and a little bit there, and she has a number of different projects going simultaneously. I think, like, even upstairs in the show that's here right now, there's some pieces that clearly have a sense of humor about them. And it's like, what do you do when you kind of like, I've gotten to this place where I know some of my work is good. Some of it's like, but some of it's really good. But when there's this sense of humor involved in the kind of photography that you do, and I guess what I'm trying to ask is, if you get somebody that has no sense of humor or like doesn't get it, and you're actually more looking for the merits of your technique or how you could improve getting your message across, or
I think you have to guide it. It's your critique, right? So in that situation, you really have to guide it. You have to say, this is what I want, and be kind of firm about that. I want, especially if it starts to go in a direction that you don't want it to go in. You say, this is what I'm looking to get out of this work from you, and can you speak to the work in those terms? And the other really, really important thing, and this just happened 2 weeks ago at a portfolio review for myself, the person just was not responding, and so in a really negative way. And so I would have another body of work. Like, so you prepare your talk for a single body of work in that situation, and you get it down to like 15 or 17 or 20 pictures, and you got your talk, and then you have another project, right? So if you get halfway through and it's not working, you go, oh, maybe you want to see, maybe I can show you this and get feedback, because that's how I usually do it.
Okay, good. That's helpful, because it's almost like Critique 101, because when you're going into it cold and you have no clue what to expect, especially if you haven't been through the academic side of it, so that, you want to come out of it with some kind of positive feedback to make your craft better.
But it's really important to remember that you paid to be there, right? And and it's your critique, and take control of it, as much as you can, without being a jerk.
Reiterate about critique is a variable thing. There's lots of forms and formats of critiquing. It's not only the classroom or their portfolio review. It's showing your work to your friends, to people who are supportive. We all need a community of people to support us. And there's tremendous feedback that they can give you in that support, but also to show it to strangers, to people that are not involved in photography or not making art. I believe that photography is a process by which we're communicating, and it's very important to follow that through. If we make the pictures, it's partly our job to kind of get the work out there. And I show my work to just about anybody who look at it.
Chris?
I think probably part of the how to nurture that creative process for the people who are showing work is for the people who are actually looking at the work to remember why it is they're there, the context of why it is they're there. So if you're a staff at a college, like why are these kids coming to class? Like why are they in a photo class? Is it because they want to have developed a sort of hobby, or is it because they want to be professional with it beyond there? And I think those are different contexts. And so I would say the most nurturing thing that you can do is to remember why, to the creative process, is to remember why you're sitting in that chair looking at work. And I think you're basically sort of teaching someone how to speak a language, and you have to understand your own limitations of the languages that you can speak, and how you can enhance that person's visual linguistics by your expertise, not within the context of your own perspective, I guess.
So the reviewer needs to bring their language into the discussion and not leave it just to the reviewee. Is that what you're saying?
I think the idea of like a critique process as being that you're sort of a privileged person to, no matter what level somebody's at, you're a privileged person to be looking at their work and to sort of have that sort of humility in that process, but then also think to, understand everything's contextual. Like my wife is by far the best person to show things to because she just doesn't really care about photography that much. And I know by showing her certain pictures, if they're, it's a great picture, and I know that that's probably like more conceptually driven and therefore like sort of a one-trick pony at the end of it all. So I think that the way to nurture the creative process is to know your own deficiencies and where you're really smart at what you do, and then pass people off to somebody who can speak better to what refer them along to the other bazillion people who want to look at work and tell them what they think, you know?
Well, that's an important part of this, that it doesn't all rely on one reviewer, that you should get many perspectives. Back there?
I think the person doing the critique has a responsibility to expand their vocabulary, learn the language. They may not be eloquent in terms of their language skills, and if they're going to do critique, I think it is, and they should be responsible to expand their vocabulary so that you get something better. Oh, that's good, that's bad. You know, this should be cropped this way. I know I sat through a critique of a number of people, and I mean, that was the critique of everything. Oh, you should have cropped it this way, you should have cropped it that way. It's like, that's not why we were all there. We wanted a little bit more than that. Probably one of the best critiques I've sat through photography was from a sculpture, which was very interesting. We had people very upset that we brought in a sculptor to critique the photographs, but he was great because he had the language, and he dealt with a lot of concepts. He looked at the pictures, he tried to see what the picture was saying, and he dealt with that. It wasn't someone who just said, oh, this should be cropped here, there, and everywhere. So I think the person doing the critique has a responsibility to expand their own vocabulary and things like that.
No, and I think that's an important concept, too, that we're not just making photographs, we're making art, and any artist has something valid to say about this.
Yeah, just to follow up a little bit, I think that's exactly right. I mean, it's the reviewer's responsibility to make sure that they're doing their job and giving constructive criticism and passing it along if they aren't an expert at it. I mean, some of that's what I do if I'm critiquing somebody's work in that situation in a portfolio review. If I can't speak to it, I will try to come up with names for them to look at or talk to or whatever, especially if it's another person at the review. And I think that's a very responsible thing to do. It's important.
Other questions right there?
Yeah, I was just gonna add. I teach at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago for their continuing studies department. So I teach high school kids that are going to college early. So oftentimes they don't have that language, so I try to find ways to introduce them to that language without being fearful of talking about their newly made work. So I do something similar to you, Neil. I have them eat apples privately, and they decide when they're finished with their apple, and then we critique the apples. I've grown comfortable with the idea that they think I'm a total weirdo. But
I want to be in your class.
It ends up being really successful, the way that they talk about their history of learning how to eat an apple, why they chose the red over the green, or the size or the type, and why they ate it in a certain way, and certain thresholds they won't go past, like eating the seeds. And it's always relatable in the after critiques where you can say, we all have different preferences and different ways of approaching something.
I agree. I think you have to freak the system,
yeah,
pretty much. And if you're an artist and a creative person, it's your job to be creative in the context of the critique. You need to shake it up. If it's the same thing every week, week after week, it's deadly. Right?
Right there.
I kind of wanted to just add that one technique of many, but one technique that I like to use is that I try and encourage kind of team building. So so this is more in a classroom atmosphere as opposed to a one-on-one portfolio review. But so they feel comfortable with each other to the extent that I want to encourage dissension in the ranks. I want to say, oh, this is phenomenal for X, Y, and Z. And I want them to respond, no, that's bullshit for Z, Y, and W. And I want them to scream it. I want them to disagree with each other. I want them to disagree with me. And I think by breaking the barrier of me being this lovely little dictator of, yes, I know the right answer, and you're going to make your apple red and big, and you're going to eat those damn seeds, right? Which I can say sometimes. But I want them to know that I can be right, I can be wrong, but that they can decide that, right? And I think it encourages them to basically think for themselves.
Yeah. And assert their own beliefs.
Right.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah. Other comments? Jill?
Yeah, I just want to raise the issue of critique as a means of establishing relationships and, a path for the person whose work is getting critiqued. It's maybe more a function of review events than in the classroom setting, but I think that for me has always been a really important aspect of, not what you can get out of something immediately, but how the critique can function over time and how the relationship with the reviewer or, things that they say that lead you to the next point on the chain has an importance and a relevance.
All right, let's move on to the next question. And what does not work? What are the real pitfalls to avoid? What are things that you found just are really the wrong things to do in a critique session that could squash creativity, that could really put somebody in a negative way that's really going to be detrimental to them? And I'm sure we all have something to say about this. Anybody want to take first crack?
I think one of the things I try to really guard against is assuming that I know what's right for them. I mean, I'm going to give them my best feedback, but new things happen, new work is made because it's not familiar when somebody is doing something new. And so to not always assume that you know because you think you've seen a lot and you have some idea of context. Maybe somebody's doing something really new that I just don't see it. And I try to not get in their way, maybe try to ask some good questions, but just being really careful around assuming that I know what their pathway is.
Neil?
So many years in the profession, I was thinking, just as Chehalis was talking about that, is when I first started teaching photography, I was probably 26 or 27, and my students were 22 or 23. So not much difference. And the way I taught in those days was that I was one of them. I was just a little bit farther along, and we kind of existed as equals, somehow kind of equals. As I got older, and after all, as the professor gets older, the students don't, right? So they're still 22, but I'm 64 or something. It's a very different thing. And so in the context of that, I tried not to be this all-knowing, all-authoritative kind of character. I tried to keep humble, and I tried to keep my place in relationship to them, to be sensitive to their needs and where they were coming from. And they tended to predefine me as being the answer guy. And I'd break that apart right away. I didn't always know the answers.
So you never reached 30 then?
I never got there.
Yeah, I mean, similar to Neil, I mean, I think, and Shayla, I mean, I try not to, I know I said earlier that I said you shouldn't, but that is very specific to a certain, it's a very specific situation where there's a student doing something that, it's not that they shouldn't do it, it's that they need to do something else. Just to clarify that, I just want to clarify. But normally I don't ever do that, right? I mean, it's only in very specific situations. So I try to always look at their work on their own terms and figure out what it is they're trying to do, and try to keep my mind as open as possible to the possibilities that it might be something. Hopefully, it is something that I've never seen before, and that's really exciting, not early on encourage them to just make pictures, whatever they want to do. It doesn't matter as long as they're making work. I think that's the most important thing, and then through that process, they figure out what they want to do. So early on, I would never say, you shouldn't do this, right? Mm-hmm. It's a very specific situation, just to be clear.
I just want to qualify what I said about being humble. Not always, because at Northeastern we had the no cute rule.
Yeah, exactly.
And the no cute rule was no duckies, babies, squirrels, puppies, kitties.
Mushrooms and stuffed animals.
Yeah.
I like mushrooms.
I taught for years at Harvard. There were no Harvard Yard allowed pictures.
Right.
At Northeastern, there was no Christian Science pictures. Yeah. So there were rules.
Yeah. Questions back there? I say questions, but I also mean comments, of course.
Can you talk about the importance of references in critique, like referencing other artists, knowing or telling your students or talking to your students about contemporary work that's being made that might be relevant to what they're working on or interested in?
Yeah, that was a big topic for me, and I would tell them in the beginning of the class, if I reference somebody or a show or a book or something, I'm not playing around. I'll require you to go there because it's not said lightly. If I say, go look at Gary Winogrand or somebody else, you have to do that, and I'll call them on it, because it's about the most important thing I think I could do.
Yeah, I agree with that. It's try to always bring up people that are, that the students know or don't know. Sometimes they think they know certain artists and they haven't really looked at it. So maybe reminding them to go to the library and look at books and go to shows and trying to encourage them to go to all the wonderful openings and shows we have in Boston, whenever they can. It's really, really important. I use that all the time.
I think that's a really important question, and I think there's a very fine line between making a useful reference, and I have seen some instructors, and I've had some instructors, well, it's kind of like, oh, you remind me of my cousin, you look just like, Murphy Brown or whatever this, and I think there's a fine line, like, be aware of where you fit into the context, be aware what your similarities are, how are you different, and how can you develop your own voice is a real question, but I think that I've seen also it go a little too far the other way, where there's no conversation about, really what's there, and it's just comparing you to some other person and some other artist, and I don't know how useful that is, except to make sure they're aware that they're in a particular field of other artists that are doing something similar, maybe.
Yeah, I usually use that context to help guide them into a way, to help them see better what they're doing. I mean, that's kind of the point. Not that I want them to emulate that, I think, but it's to help them. And sometimes it's an artist that isn't even doing anything like visually like the student is trying to do, but the context or the content or the idea behind it is similar, and so sometimes that's really important too. So it's hard to keep up with all that stuff, but that's what you have to do.
Okay. Is there a comment by the microphone there, Chris?
I found that one of the most useful comments I got on my work actually came from a colleague in my design firm who said my work reminded him of the short stories of Raymond Carver. And I didn't know those stories all that well, and went back and started to read them and learned something about that was probably in my subconscious that I was doing, but that I related to very strongly once I read those stories. So again, going to other disciplines can be a very useful thing. I just wanted to go back to the last question for a second. I think it's incumbent upon us as people who go to portfolio reviews to A, know what we want, and B, research the reviewers. If they run galleries, go look at the people that they're showing. If they're with museums, what are they doing? And so forth. When you don't do that, it's potluck. When you do that, you begin to find people, I think, who will critique your work along lines that are more relevant to you.
Good point.
Yeah, that's exactly right. You should do your homework. Yeah.
Other comments on this question?
Well, actually, I wanted to say, I think that's a really good point about bringing in different disciplines. And when I used to do a capstone class, I would actually just make the seniors read a novel all semester. And they had to respond to the novel. And it wasn't even that they had to necessarily make any work about it, but they just had to read the book. And we would talk about it. And that would change kind of how they even thought about their own work or the world sometimes. And, people don't read books very often. And it was kind of an interesting kind of thing. And I always learned a ton from it. I got to read the book a lot, and I learned a lot from them and their interpretation of that. And I think it's really helpful to bring in other disciplines.
Okay. The next question, I think, is the most interesting question that I'm going to ask is, what does success look like in this field, in critique, in art? I mean, we talk around the edges of it, but what is this art school creativity? How do we know if it's working? What does success look like? What does it smell like? What does it feel like? What are you hoping to see from the students?
It smells like greenback. No, I'm just kidding. No, I would say that when you make a comment to someone, you have a conversation with someone you're working with, and you see the light go on, and they come back to the class a week or 2 weeks later, and the work is different, and you see it, and they see it, and everyone in the room sees it, and it's just like, they could be here, and they go, boom, jump up. And sometimes, I mean, when that happens, you know that the critique process is succeeding for them.
It's sort of magic. I mean, you can't really describe it, but you could see it. And, yeah.
I think there's an important component in there about being able to vocalize, to talk about the work, to be involved in the process of communicating with their work, but also with their words about their work, to be effective is very important. And I think that's a growing process. Very often students are not able to talk about their pictures at all in the beginning.
I mean, some people are more or less articulate. You know, there are great photographers who can't talk about their work. There are people who can talk wonders about their work and are not great photographers. You know, I think it goes both ways. But what is creativity in the work, though? That's what I'm trying to explore here. What is success in the work itself? Bruce?
I mean, that's such a hard thing to, I mean, you know, like you said, you see it when you see it. It's hard. It has to do with the individual and what they're trying to communicate and how well they communicate that, whether it's visually or not, and that those two things are kind of in sync, and that they also see where they are in whatever history they're putting themselves into. And you know, sometimes students never get that, and sometimes they get it right away. And you know, and sometimes it's like you have a critique, and next week their work is completely different. Like they've made a whole, for whatever reason, like something changed in their brain. So it's all those things. You know?
I think also sometimes you can introduce someone you're working with to their family. Like they don't know who their family is, and you say, "Hey, here's your family," and they go, "Oh my God, I have a family." And so they hook into that, the current of the power of that connection that they have with the history, and it can be really exciting.
What about the connection between craft and concept, or craft and creativity? Can they exist independently, or how do they work together?
Well, I said earlier how I believed that the craft needed to be capable to express. I always use the analogy of trying to listen to music on a stereo, and one of the woofers is cracked, and every time something in the music hits that bass note, it goes crunch instead of making the bass note. And I think when I see photographs that have a flaw or a problem with them, I'm keying in now to looking for the problem in the subsequent images rather than the actual imagery. And so it's just my own particular quirk that I want that to be taken care of and done knowledgeably.
You want to go? I think that for me, they're tied, and you can't separate them really, but they should be appropriate for each other. So and so, you know, sometimes that means that, you know, the print is not perfect on purpose, but it has to be on purpose. I think it has to do with the intention of it, and having that aligned with the concept of what the work is supposed to be. And I think that's the hardest thing sometimes for people to understand, especially students. You know, they get into either the track where it either has to be absolutely perfect, or they don't care and they're just thinking about the idea. And I think they need to be too.
Hypothetically, why is this print blurry? Well, because I didn't have much light, and I was hand-holding the camera, and I took the picture at a 15th of a second, and I didn't hold it steady. Not good enough.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
I think that's a really good topic, because when I lead critiques with more advanced students, I think Neil was pretty on the money with intro students, but I tend to say, okay, we're going to take care of technical problems first and then get to the concepts. And I feel when you guide it that way, the other students, not necessarily the student that's getting critiqued, doesn't get bogged out or hide behind just saying, oh, it's too magenta. Oh, I think you should crop it this way. And then they have to talk about the concept after the fact. You get it out of the way first, and usually that makes the student feel more relieved because they know the technical stuff's coming no matter what if there's a problem, and then you moved on to the basics. Unless they're doing something that's based in technique.
Right, and that usually brings them up to, when you do that, it actually creates this dynamic in the classroom where they know that if they bring something that's not technically right, they know they're going to get that, and so they work really hard to not have that happen. Because they want to talk about the ideas, they don't want to talk about the technical stuff.
Other comments on this? Yeah?
I'm just curious what your experience, the panel's experience between your in-class critique versus your junior and senior jury critique.
Oh, I see what you're saying. So like review boards or juries, like at the end of the semester when you're looking at, as opposed to the in-class.
The experience that you have with your fellow students versus the panel teachers.
It complicates the dialogue exponentially. Because whoever the crew is that's looking at the work, if they have a good working conversation, it can be great. But what I've seen happen sometimes, and it's sad, is that the dialogue turns into kind of, this is indelicate, but kind of a pissing contest between the faculty. That doesn't work, right?
Right.
So you have to, I don't know if that sheds any light on it, but I think it really comes down to the working chemistry of the people that are working together to give you a meaningful response.
Yeah, and it's all their responsibility to make sure that they're coming at it from that perspective, that they're trying to help out the student. But that can happen. I mean, that's the trouble with people, right? They all have different opinions. And so you get people. But it's different because it's more formal. I mean, just mechanically, it's more formal. There's a higher kind of expectation that the work is finished and ready to be shown. So coming into a jury situation like that, that's what I'm expecting. And so when I don't see that, it's not as good as when I do see that. But that's what I'm expecting, yeah. And then what's really great too is I actually love the dialogue with other professors because I don't see them and I don't see the work often. So I'm seeing new work for the first time, and maybe one of the professors is there that helped the work along and can give insight. But it's nice to see how my colleagues talk about work, and I learn a lot from that too.
Yeah, it's true.
Any other comments about the core question here about what success looks like with creativity and how do you know when you see it? Okay. All right. The next topic is just the difference between classroom critiques, which is what we've started talking about here, but also portfolio reviews, which is a different type of critique. And I know that Neil was just a reviewer at the New England Portfolio Reviews, and Bruce was a reviewee at the New England Portfolio Reviews. And can you talk about how these reviews are different or should be different than a classroom critique?
Yeah, I think I've been doing these kinds of reviews now for several years, and they're wonderful experiences. They're exhausting, and they're hard work for the reviewer, as they are for the reviewee. But I cherish and honor that experience deeply. I learn a tremendous amount. And I think the dynamic between what somebody shows me versus my response to it is multifaceted, lots of different characteristics to that. I'm not the kind of person who says this looks nice. I try to give valuable feedback, and I do a lot of referencing. I'll try, because I don't run a gallery, I don't work in a museum, I can't give them a specific show, which is usually what they want. But I can refer them to people who can. And I do that quite a bit if I feel the work is strong. So several people whose work I've reviewed have then gone on to shows elsewhere because I've referred them to those places. So to me, it's a very important thing that I do. And I guess my message is that I take it very seriously.
And those referrals are very important because it might be very hard to even talk to a gallery person unless it comes with a referral from somebody they respect.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's what Elaine said earlier in the last session was, somebody asked about which ones do you pick when you're just sending off your slides or your files to a juried situation, and she said, you know, it's not so much that I get into the show, it's that who sees the work. Like if there's a juror that you want to see the work, and I think portfolio reviews for me function the same way. In fact, I just was in the PRC one, and I signed up for 4 people who I wanted to get my work in front of. And even though I, you know, probably could call them all up and say, can I look at my work? There's a formality there that I appreciate, and I think that gives a different level of, I guess like what Jill was saying earlier about a relationship. It builds a relationship in a really unique way. And because of the formal structure, I think. And, you know, and I'm always looking for feedback, but it's that kind of referral and that kind of relationship that I'm looking for in that situation. And it's helped me a lot. I mean, that's, you know, and it's this time I had, you know, somebody who's, you know, I actually thought had seen my work a lot. And she's like, oh, you're not doing this other thing, you're doing this? And she was really excited about that. And that was fantastic for me, because I just kind of, in our own little artist world, we think everybody sees our work, right? And, you know, obviously not, right? So that was really, really great, you know? And then another person was very excited about, you know, actually just sat back and decided that they were going to think of my retrospective show title, which was also kind of mind-blowing. At the same time, I had somebody go, you know, do you do anything else? You know, what do you do when you're not photographing around here? Like, and that was strange, but I mean, it's the relationship, and you know, and that was actually because I didn't do my homework. Going back to an earlier conversation, I didn't do my homework about that reviewer, and because of that, I got a bad crit. I wouldn't have picked him if I had thought, you know, if I had looked at what he looks at first. So. I'm sorry?
How do you go about reviewing research?
I still didn't hear the last part of it.
How
do I research them? So if they're a curator or a gallerist, I go to the gallery or I go to the museum that they're a curator at, and I see what they show, what they put their name on, and try to see that. You know, see if they're jurying shows. So if they're out in the jury world and, you know, doing those juried shows all around, I see what they pick and see if that's appropriate for my work, if I think it might be a good fit. And that's what I do. I mean, and sometimes it's a little, you know, sometimes I take a long shot, you know, sometimes, you never know. But that's how you know, so I look wherever I can at what they are showing in their own space.
I think with portfolio reviews, you kind of have to be, I've been to sort of one kind of the elk where you pay money to go sit with a bunch of people that you want to show work to. And I think you have to be really careful of that, because the photography, like if you're going there, that becomes more of a business transaction or a networking thing. And it's really not so much about the integrity of the pictures as it is trying to form these professional relationships with people, and performing and having those relationships form with people versus sort of talking about pictures for the sake of just talking about pictures are two very different things. And if you go to those portfolio reviews with an unrealized body of work or in a sort of, you know, exploratory state, I think you can leave there very twisted up with a lot of different opinions. And the reality is too, no matter who you sit in front of, they have to talk about your work. You're paying them to talk about your work, and therefore they need to talk about it. So I think that those sort of pay-to-play portfolio review sessions can be very, if you're going there to network and to promote your project and to meet with the right people that you think would fit, introduce yourself in person, and you feel that you need to pay to do that, then that's great. But I think if you're looking to just learn about your pictures in a way that's not sort of this huge swath of opinions, you have to be very careful.
And where do you find that then, if it's not at
I think through like people that you really trust and know, or you know, really localize a you know, if you want to sort of have this meeting with strangers, you know, really do that in a way that's not tied up in money. Like do that in a way that's pure to photography, not so much looking to sort of climb a professional ladder. I think you know, and I think find it, you know, if you have a friend that's a musician, someone that speaks a language, that can understand a visual language, but then also maybe is totally like naive to that too, and can come to things with sort of honesty and not that baggage of, you know, the sort of I'm expected to say something to every single person that comes through here. I mean, that's just you know, that's a grind, really.
I don't know. I think so in a way, but I also think that you can, depending on how you approach it and what, you know, what your goals are. And I think that those people look at pictures all the day, you know, like a lot of them that's what they do all day is look at pictures. And so, so yes, you're giving them money, but they also will have good things to say, and you have to keep your mind open. It might not be that you're going to get a show with them, but they might say if they say one thing, one tiny, tiny little thing that you go away with and it sticks in your head, it feels good or feels wrong, and you have to explore that. I think that's really, really important. And, you know, you can't necessarily get access to those people without doing that right now. And it's really expensive and it's horrible and blah, 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 all that stuff. But there's ways to go about that, you know, that if you find that little nugget of something, it's worth it, I think. For me, you know,
I think there are different types of portfolio reviews. I mean, clearly the national ones like PhotoFest are like that. You pay a lot of money and you're meeting leading people in the industry, and most people are there to make connections and to find ways to advance their career and work. I think something like the New England portfolio reviews here locally, the stakes aren't as high all around, and if you're just looking for feedback on your work, I think it's a good place where you can get that, as well as making connections with the New England community of galleries and museums and such.
I do think that, I think your name was Chris. I haven't seen your face yet, but you're Chris? I think are you Chris Churchill?
He is.
Oh man, you're great. Anyway.
Is it true? Did you buy his piece at the auction?
I bought his piece at the PRC auction, and
yeah.
I love it. I look at it every day, and it like changed my life. But anyway, I think Chris is shining a light on something that we as a community have to think about, and I sort of touched on this yesterday in the lecture at the PRC, which is that why are artists having to spend all this money to have these dialogues? Maybe we need to think about how we're going to restructure this a little bit, and maybe these reviewers that they're going to be benefiting from having business relationships with us, maybe they should be paying to come and look at our work or something. I mean, or maybe nobody has to pay.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a good that's a good idea. I think that's important. But I also know that most of them don't get paid. It's the institution that's making the money, especially those big ones. And like was said earlier today in the earlier panel, is that they're all poor too, actually, even though it costs a lot of money. So money has to go around somehow, right? And so, but I think thinking about how we can readdress this issue is a really important one. Right, but I also know I know when reviewers don't get paid, because my wife reviews a lot and they don't get paid.
At best, they get their expenses paid.
It's just the hotel. The hotel's making the money. Or maybe we need to have do a tent in somebody's big field and do another photo Woodstock or something where people don't have to pay that much.
Yeah, right there. Oh, yeah.
Hi, very much appreciate this. Being a little older segment of the audience here, we're forming our own professional peer group, and I wonder if any of you have done that, where it's a leaderless group, and have any ideas about pitfalls that we should be aware of or special issues.
Being closer to your generation, I formed a group, a friend and I formed a group about a year and a half ago, a discussion group. And one of the things that we defined it as being was that it wasn't to talk about our work. It wasn't to show work. It was we were all professional artists, and we were defined as talking about that characteristic. Exhibiting what's the politics, ins and outs, and so on. And I wouldn't characterize it as a big success. We had a few sessions that worked pretty well, and then we kind of floated apart. It wasn't enough to sustain it, probably. And actually, we're going to work this summer on reforming it and redefining it. So I think those kinds of things can be very valuable. It's important to go into it with eyes open. Yeah, there you go.
Yeah.
And to make sure that people know what it is and what it isn't, and then how people are selected is a big part of that.
And I just put in my 2 cents. I think that it needs a leader. I think that's the biggest thing, is trying to not have a leader. You need somebody driving the bus. Otherwise, things don't happen. It just in my experience, I think.
Even if that rotates from
right.
meeting
yeah,
to
right.
meeting.
Exactly. If it rotates from month to month or something, you need somebody kind of going, all right, we're going to do this. We're going to set down and organize it, you know. And that takes a lot of work, but that's what it takes, I think.
Yeah. I was in a group briefly, a documentary group, and it was the same problem. Nobody was empowered to be the leader, and therefore it fell apart.
Yeah.
Other comments?
Okay.
What?
Well, thanks, Rachel. I don't know. So I'm just going to comment something about one of the things that you just said. And, you know, you have to remember that life is about a collaboration. It's not just about the artists. It's about, you know, things cost money. Like galleries cost money to run, right? Like everything in life, art costs money to process and to do. So, but life is about a collaboration. It's about the collaboration that wins. And really, and I think that's what everyone has to start taking away, is that you need to start collaborating. The future is not going to happen if we don't start collaborating, and I feel quite strong about that. And also, when you're doing reviews and stuff, if you don't try, you don't know. And this is a really big game changer. I was just at PhotoFest, and it was the first time in 10 years I didn't see a lot of good portfolios, but I found one that was stellar, and I saw it in March, and it's here on the walls. So you just never know what's going to happen in life, but you gotta try. You know, you gotta flip every switch. You gotta try, and you know, everything that you can do. And also, the other thing is all about networking. You know, you really gotta get out there. You really gotta get in front of people. You really gotta talk to them. It's really critical to do these things. And I know trust me, I know how discouraging things can be. And I know how many times you can hear the word no, but you really just gotta like be persistent. You know, you gotta believe in what you're doing. You gotta believe in your work.
And you can't expect miracles overnight either at these reviews. I mean, sometimes you'll meet with somebody and it'll be a ho-hum review session, but 2 years later that person may remember the work and start paying more attention to it. It's really about building relationships over a long period of time.
That and the follow-up. If you're there and you get anybody interested in what you're doing, and they say contact me, contact them. Don't do what I do and not contact people, right? I've learned this the hard way. In fact, I think actually Chris and I were at Photo Lucida in 2006 together. Actually, were you there in 2006? No, all right, never mind then. So, but there was somebody there. It wasn't you. Sorry, mistaken. But that went on, you know, after that, because they followed through. They went like this, and I didn't, and I went like this. And so that's the big thing. It's like that's what I learned. You know, it's like if somebody says call me, call them, email them right away.
Remember what Bruce said earlier about it's your work, it's not you? This gets me into the thick skin principle.
Yeah.
You really have to develop a thick skin. You need to be able to take the heat, take the criticism. If you're putting yourself in the fire, it's going to be both good and bad. And when the criticism comes across that's harsh, like Chehalis said, it can be the most meaningful. But also, it's not annihilating you or stopping you from working. Right. It's just hard to take. You pick yourself up and you try to move on.
And it's also always just one person's perspective, too.
I like to tell my students that, remember, it's just art, nobody's going to die, right? Because, you know, they get really intense, you know, and just remember that. Like, it's just art, you're making it, nobody's going to die.
And we're all going to be dead in a few years, and it won't matter, and the sun's going to explode, and none of this is going to be here.
Yeah, that's the other side of it, right, yeah.
Did I see a hand up out there? Well, we've got a couple hands up right here.
Is there, could you address the issue of the internet, and are there platforms emerging or developing that would, you know, in a sense, reduce the need for doing portfolio reviews in that formal context that you were talking about, and, you know, basically do it one-on-one the way the internet is allowing disintermediation of a lot of industries, and it seems like it might allow it here as well.
Well, there's certainly a lot of platforms to post your work where lots of people can see your work, but you're talking about a one-to-one.
There's actually a new, and I'm drawing a blank on the name, but there's a new a new like kind of service where you can meet a select group of. Do you know what it is? What? IES? IEYEIS? No, I can't. Oh, us. IS? Is that what it is?
Arthur's trying to write it down here. So do we have it right here,
Too
Joe?
much rock and roll.
Is that right?
EYE. Oh.
IST.
IST. I get it.
Another big one is critical mass.
Yeah.
It's a little different,
That's a little different.
But it's,
yeah.
it's not.
There's a few things happening like that. There's actually actually on the table out there. There's a little tiny thing called the Art Photo Index, and that's a website. And I think it's beta right now. It's supposed to be going live this summer. It's still beta, right?
From Photo
but
Eye.
you can get on that, and that's another way, another vehicle that you get there and you get to have a few pictures and people look at it. It's done by the same people that do Photo Eye.
Other than just people posting comments.
Yeah. Right.
I mean, really what we're looking for is some type of Skype mechanism where...
Well, it is?
Yeah, that sounds great. Is it just for photography or all visual arts? Or?
That's cool. Yeah. So check that out.
It's geared more almost for a lot of the reviewers are photographers, so it's not only aesthetic and critical in terms of where the work can go. It's also technical in terms of that aspect as well.
I don't know if people are still using Flickr or not. It's kind of passé, I guess, in some ways. But at one point, I had an online crit group. It was a private group, and we showed work to each other a lot, had a lot of feedback and dialogue. And I mean, people don't really have that much time. But if you had it set up in such a way that, on some specific week during the month, everyone's going to post new work, and then anyone who has time to write some feedback could be, you can organize it.
Yeah. Another question here.
I just think a lot of people that used to have a conversation on Flickr seem to be conversing on Facebook. And
maybe there's a time for a Flickr revival.
But there are a lot of Facebook communities as well.
there's just so much. I wish someone would just burn it all down so we could start over.
Yeah.
I actually come from a different background. I studied architecture, and the reviews that I used to have in architecture were absolutely brutal. To where you would work on a project for 6 months, and work on it with every piece of your soul, and someone would say, I really think you need to start over. And I feel like there's a proliferation of back patting and thumbs upping. And this constant dialogue about nurturing the artists, I feel can be extremely detrimental, actually, and that I found that I learned the most and I learned the fastest when someone was really brutally honest with me, and I have a really difficult time finding that in the photography community. And
I can give you some names.
I know. You can take my class at RISD.
I'm not trying to challenge people, but I think that there needs to be a little bit more of that interjected into some of the conversations that I see taking place. And I think that social media has expanded that
to where if you say anything sort of challenging about a photograph that someone's posted or whatever, you really, and in the forums in particular too, you risk sort of, personal attacks and questions and all that. And I feel like there needs to be in many cases a higher level of criticism added to the dialogue about photography.
Well, I think the concept of nurturing was more talking about an undergraduate educational environment where I think people really do need that. That's what they're there for. But in a professional critique environment, you're clearly right.
But only for the first year.
Those kids are going to go out into the world at some point and have to face an art director. And in many of the cases I see when I'm teaching, they're completely unprepared to have a serious conversation with an art director who's going to be extremely critical. And they don't have the thick skin that they really need to succeed in this business. And I just feel like, it needs to be addressed.
I think there's a really big distinction between brutal honesty and useful honesty.
Yeah.
I'm definitely all for telling the truth and sending people back to the dark room, and they wish you wouldn't, and I've done this 10 times, I'm like, do it 11 times then. But I don't think there's any place for brutality in
Well,
our
is
world.
saying that something just is not good, is that brutal?
I think that there is a difference between brutal honesty and useful honesty, and we all know what it is.
Okay. Other questions on this? Nancy?
I'm also, used to projecting my voice and not over mic. I'm also from the world of architecture, and I've done some portfolio reviews in the photography world, and I agree that it's been hard to find reviewers who say why they have the opinions that they have. I will say that I've learned something from every review I've had, whether I've been mismatched or not. I always can take something away. But, I've really been delighted to hear you people say that that's how you approach it. What are you trying to do? And then how successful that is, and why it works and why it doesn't work. I agree that there is never a place for just brutality. There can be a critique. Sometimes people who are that way, they're doing it just for the sake of being brutal. I always want to know why. I have a thick skin, but I want to know why. And if you can't tell me why, and especially in photography, I'm trying to develop my language. Even though I'm coming from another art form, there is a different culture between them. So I'm trying to develop my language, so I really need to know that why. The most discouraging review that I've had is when someone will say, I don't know what to say. I don't know what to say about your work. And my work's a bit painterly because I also come from a painterly background. So it doesn't always fit into someone's definition of photography, which I understand. But I still want the question, the whys answered.
I would say in response to that response that you got, I haven't seen your work, so I can't really speak from a place of any sort of basis. But I think also, sometimes it takes time for people to learn how to read what you're doing and to understand. Sometimes it takes time for people to learn how to see what you're doing. So.
Well, that's what I go away telling myself, They
Well,
need to look at
and
it
so
again.
that's, I think it's on both sides. I think that the person reviewing needs to, say why, right? But it's also your. No, I know you're not complaining. Right. No, yeah. It's part of it is saying, well, can you say why? I think that, and you know that. I'm not saying you don't. But
well, I'm really encouraged to hear you people because I'll be more apt to say that.
Yeah.
Because I am trying to learn the culture, and now I feel like I can say, all right, I'm going to respond to them in that way, and I'm going to be more directive. And so I guess what I'm saying is this panel has been fantastic, and I think you must all be fabulous reviewers.
Nice. My favorite students are architecture majors, actually. I get a lot of them at RISD. I teach a view camera class there, and I almost always have at least one architecture major that comes and takes the view camera class, and they're like happy people because the critiques are so different, and I don't pull anything off the wall and rip it up, you know.
Well,
and
one of the things is people can die in our projects.
Yeah, I know, exactly. People can die, exactly. That's exactly right. Yeah.
We really have to be responsible.
Yeah, exactly.
There are many accomplished photographers who come from the architecture field. I've met many. Rania Matar, for one, she was involved in a panel discussion we had yesterday, and she's a trained architect.
We're wonderful people.
Yes.
So are photographers. Somebody else want the mic? Thank you.
All right, let me kind of pull this back a bit to a very specific question about reviews. That was on our list that we spoke about earlier. Dealing with cliches, dealing with cuteness, you know, pictures of babies and mushrooms and flowers. How do you deal with this as reviewers when you see work that you've just seen a million times and may be competent, but it's just something we've seen a million times and is a cliche? And
it's an interesting question. I mean, that's part of my recent bad critique was that the person looked at my work and said, this could just be at the Hallmark store. And I was shocked, actually, that somebody actually said that to me. And it was interesting because suddenly I was on that other side of the fence where, like, when I say to students, like, well, you know, it's a duck. Like, if you're gonna make a picture of a duck, make a really good picture of the duck. Like, you should, you know, research animal pictures and make one that blows me away. Like, I'll say that. I won't say don't take a picture of a duck, right? But I'll say it has to be good picture of the duck, you know, and it has to be amazing. I think that's
I told you about the no cute rule that we had, and so I probably ought to address it, but one student one year took that as a distinct challenge, and she made a set of pictures of her just obtained puppy that was amazing. Puppy was defecating, the puppy was, you know, in all kinds of trouble. So it sort of extended and really kind of told me where to get off. It was really good.
every rule's to be broken. Right?
Yeah, that's right.
Chehalis, mushrooms?
It was when I was teaching in New Hampshire. What can I say? There were just so many pictures of mushrooms, and they were all kind of the same. The mushroom in the middle of the frame, and it was just a nice mushroom. And so I made the no mushroom rule.
Yeah, I think challenge. I mean, what Neil said, challenging him is the most important thing with that. You just say, make this really good. Make it like a mushroom picture I've never seen before. See if you can do that. You know, and throwing it back. You know, basically throwing it back at them and saying, if this is what you want to do, make it good.
Right, like your mushroom picture should make us hallucinate.
Right. Yeah. Exactly.
Just by looking at it.
Right.
Yeah.
You don't even have to smoke it.
Isn't what you're getting at trying to urge the photographer to have a unique vision? I mean, if you're saying this is common, but you have to bring something more of yourself. Yeah. I mean, I've taken wonderful calendar shots myself and thought, okay, well, that's nice.
Yeah.
I think the thing about students is very often they're making a cliche, but they don't know it's a cliche.
Right.
Yeah.
So
right
part of our job is to help them come into that world to realize that that is a cliche.
Well, I guess the corollary to this question is, in the art school environment, is there a great picture of something that's been photographed a million times and somebody just did it one more time and did it great? Or does every photographer need to bring something new to the table?
A teacher in Mass Art told the student she doesn't want to see photos of John Hancock and pets. And so I said she should say she doesn't want to see photos of people and children because she's seen enough of them. And I see as a challenge to take a subject, the John Hancock, whatever, that everybody, quote unquote, took from any angle and to show it from a way that no one else did and surprise people.
Yeah. Other comments on this issue? Got some questions up here?
I think it kind of correlates or addresses that a little bit because that was something that I was having a hard time with. This idea that, especially in certain or particular galleries, there's always this really intensely pervasive, pain and suffering and the darker sides of life that if you've actually lived on that side of the fence in your life, and you might want to be sort of trying to focus on something really completely different and showing sort of the beauty of life, not in a cliche manner. I'm wondering if you can find a way to do that. Is that going to be something that's ever going to really be accepted by the art world? Or is it always going to have to be, that sort of, it's not art unless there's suffering involved?
That's a good and important question. I mean, do artists have to suffer, and does art have to show suffering?
I think everyone has to suffer.
We all suffer.
We all suffer.
That's right.
Arthur made a beautiful piece called The First Noble Truth, and it's this little crank, and there's this wire pushing this guy in the head. The First Noble Truth. There is suffering. No one escapes.
But there's an audience for everybody, right?
Right.
No, there's an audience. There's an audience for every picture. You just have to find it. Again, it goes back to doing homework, right? So there are galleries that will never show things that don't have people in them. There's galleries that will only show dark black and white pictures. You just have to kind of find where that place is for yourself, and that's just researching and doing just getting on the internet and doing gallery searches. It's painstaking. There's no kind of there's no book that says go here. That's the hard part. But if you do it with friends, build a little community. And it goes back to like we were talking about earlier. Build a community with your friends or people you like and people whose work you like and they like your work, and not just in that nice like Facebook I like it way, but a really that they're supportive and understanding, right? And you build that community and then you divide up the country and you find out where your galleries will be.
Nobody's ever criticized Ansel Adams or Elliot Porter for not showing suffering, and they do what they do so extraordinarily well that we love them.
I think people have criticized them for that. I think there has been criticism about that from in the world, but
well, clearly there's been criticism, but I think by and large they've been accepted as accomplished artists. There'll always be sticks in the mud.
Yeah.
All right, why don't we just open this up now just to any other comments on the issue of critique and creativity?
I actually think that there was one topic that I think is really important that we missed, which is the thing about what happens when someone brings in work that's visibly shows you that they're in trouble.
Okay, yeah.
I think we've all had, I've had example, I had a student that I'm pretty sure getting help averted a suicide. The student brought in work that was clearly, she was in big trouble. What do you do then? You can call counseling services.
Well, that's what you have to do. There's laws of what you have to do.
Right.
There's, you call counseling services. You make people aware of what the problem is and that you're concerned. It's actually legally you have to do that in a state institution, and I think that even in private institutions. So there's a legal thing that you got to do,
Right.
and there's systems in place at every college for things like that. And being aware as a teacher, being aware of what those parameters are is really, really important.
And what actually is the law? What are you required as a teacher?
If you see something like that, you have to contact student services and tell them, I'm concerned about this person. You can't actually, you can say, I need you to look at this person, because you can't intervene because you're not trained. And so you have to get it to the professional, and then they can intervene. And then once that happens, you actually can't talk to the student about it, and the student really shouldn't talk to you about it.
But they do.
Oh yeah, I know they do. And you just have to remind them. But it's also, they can actually have every right to say what they want. They can share whatever information they want with you, but you can't share it, right? But you have to make the phone call. It's like if you know somebody wants to hurt themselves, you have to call 911. It's that simple.
Are there ethical boundaries of a photograph itself?
Say more about the question.
Well, you're talking about the consequences of this person. They might be suicidal. But what about the pictures themselves? Are there pictures that are out of bounds?
I've never seen it in my classes.
It can happen. And you have to, again, I think you have to bring it to the administration and discuss it with your colleagues in your department if you're in that situation.
Like racism themes or
anything that's
racism, pornography.
That's an issue. People being hurt.
Seen it.
I've seen it, and you have to. you have to address it in some way. And one way is talking with your colleagues, and then the other way is getting the administration involved. You have to deal with it in the classroom, and sometimes, interesting enough, the students deal with that really well sometimes. Sometimes not, but they often have a way of, there's ways that they deal with it in a really interesting way, and they can do, I think they can say whatever they want to each other. I haven't had it directly in my classroom, but I've been involved in a department that had things like that happening.
I did have a student, I had to be followed by an undercover police for the last 2 weeks of school this year, actually.
Wow.
Had a student that was really on the edge, but,
Well, on that happy note, maybe we should.
on that happy note, we can open it up to the
Yeah.
Well, anybody in the audience have any experiences or questions about this issue? Well, then let's just open it up to any issues we've spoken about. Yeah.
Close to, by the way.
I just wanted to ask other educators in the room about, in a sense, coming out as having your preferences in art. It's kind of an illusion that any one of us would look at young people's work totally neutrally. I just find occasionally, I love lots and lots of pictures, and I look at lots and lots of different kind of artwork. But with a lot of humor, sometimes I say, wow, I just have to respond to this. Let me tell you where I come from. I love this picture, and I love it because, and this is something very close to my heart. And then there might be another kid who brings work that I'm kind of putting my head on the side and saying, it's not my kind of thing, but I like it, but I think I don't know what to say. So I just would like a little more honesty from everybody or not honesty, maybe help to say, to put down the veil that we're neutral. We're not neutral.
No, we're not neutral.
I agree completely with that. All of us are active exhibitors. Our work is published. We're having shows every couple of years, very often locally. So, particularly with my case, my students knew exactly where I was coming from, and I didn't try to hide that. I also tried to keep an open mind. One of the reasons I enjoyed being a teacher was that I learned more from them than they probably did from me. And they kept me young, and I get an understanding of what a 22-year-old was thinking of, and now, that kind of thing. It's really wonderful. So, but I never hid where I was coming from. They knew exactly what my bias was.
But does that drive them to make work that they think you like, or to make work like you do?
But sometimes against those standards as well. Yeah.
Yeah, it comes back to the critique, I guess, because if lots of students will try that and try to make the work that they think you're gonna like, and you just have to you have to be honest with them and say, like, yes, I like that kind of work, but actually because I make work like that, you have to do it better than me, right? So actually I end up with lots of students not doing landscape photography, right? Because I'm so hard on them sometimes because of that. I think that that's my bias. It's the thing I know, so I'm harder on them. But I also they always know. I think, right, guys? They always know where I stand. I think in the classroom. There's a few of them in here, and I think that I'd always let them know where I'm coming from.
I'm totally on board with both of these guys over here. And to address what you were just saying, maybe you can just be totally upfront and say, teachers can't be unbiased. I'm not unbiased. I'll give you the most useful feedback I possibly can, given my range of experience and understanding. And if you can see where that person is really sitting in the context, maybe you can even just say, hey, call my friend, so-and-so, I'll give you the number, and maybe they'll get together and look at your work, because they're actually more qualified to speak about your work than I am, because I'm in a different camp. I can speak as well as I can, given who I am and where I'm coming from. But, yeah.
And that's where, like, sharing with your colleagues, too, like, say, oh, go talk to this teacher about that, because they can deal with it another way. And, being honest about that, too, in the classroom, like, this is the person you should talk to about that. It's really important.
All right, we got time for one or two more comments. I see a hand up there, yeah.
I was just going to follow up on that last question. I teach at 5 different institutions in Chicago, and I have to say that finding the institution that I'm most proud to be at tends to make the most sense in how I react to photos. I guess what I mean is, like, at certain jobs I've worked at, like, I can't have the no cat picture rule because the featured work in the hallway are cat pictures, like advertising the other classes. And of course, being an artist myself, I'm drawn to conceptually engaging work. So I'm not going to get excited about cat pictures, and they're going to wonder why, because it's featured in the hallway. So I think finding the right institution for the instructor is a really important part of it.
As well as for the student, of course.
Yeah.
Any more comments? Yep, one more. Francine.
I think the most important sentence that I've read in college, it was one of the first things, it's the first sentence of John Berger's Ways of Seeing. It's what you see is dictated by what you know and what you believe. And that stands true for every piece of work you show to anybody else. They'll come and look at it from a completely different place than you may be in, and then who the next person is going to see. So you have to keep that in mind, that everyone has different backgrounds, different feelings about things, different knowledge of artists that's already been made. So it's just something I always keep in my mind, and it's what I think about when I make work too. You know, it doesn't have to please every audience, and stay true to yourself, I think.
Yeah, that's very important. Are there any more hands up? All right, well, thank you all for coming here tonight. I'd like to thank our panelists. And I'd like to thank the Flash Forward Festival for inviting us here.
Thank you, Flash Forward.
Yay, thank you.
Before you all go, I just want to thank again the panelists for a really fascinating discussion. Also to remind you that this evening in this space here from 7 to 10 is the opening of the Small Prints exhibition, so we encourage you all to either hang around or come back for that. And I would just like to thank the presenting sponsor of the Flash Forward Festival, TD Canada Trust, and also to thank the Fairmont Battery Wharf for being such a great host. And thank you all for coming.